Good morning, everyone. It is a huge joy and honor to be here to chair this panel. Thank you, Paul, and thank you all for attending. Thank you, Heloisa and Benjamin. Heloisa Buarque de Hollanda is a writer, editor, literary critic, and professor. She has always been interested in subjects which are outside the university or the market, contemporary things, gender issues, ethnic issues, and the periphery. She was the director of the publishing house of the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro, the Museum of Image and Sound in Rio de Janeiro. She's the author of numerous books, including 26 Poets Today, Feminism as a Critique of Literature, Digital and Choices, a self-autobiography. She is also launching now an independent publishing house called HB, in partnership with E-Galaxy. It's re-releasing several important books like 26 Poets Today and the Incomplete Correspondence of Ana C. And it's a beautiful site, and I recommend that you all visit it. Benjamin Moser is a writer, critic, and editor. He graduated in history. He was born in the United States in Houston, lives between France and Holland. He's the author of Clarice, Why This World, a biography of Clarice Lispector, soon to be launched by Compagnie. It was chosen one of the books of the year by the New York Times. Benjamin is responsible for publicizing Clarice outside of Brazil. He organized the volume that's just been released by Rocco, Todos os Pontos, about Clarice, and he's launching in Planeta Auto-Imperialism, essays on Brazilian history, and he's preparing a book next year by Companhia das Letras about Susan Sontag. And news hot off the press is that Moser was considered the first Itamaraty Award for Cultural Diplomacy. Okay, probably Ana Cristina Cesar would not have become Ana C if it were not for Heloisa Buarque de Hollanda, despite the fact that she had appeared in the newspapers as a child writing her first poems. It was Heloisa who realized that she was a great writer, and she published her work in '76 for the first time in the 26 Poets Today. After this, Heloisa became a fundamental part of the team that produced the handcrafted books made by Ana Cristina. So she was a great friend, confidant, and she was also her thesis supervisor at the Federal University in Communications when Ana C studied and published Literature is Not a Document. She was responsible for having placed Ana C on the map. And if Heloisa discovered Ana C, Moser rediscovered Clarice Lispector. In 5 years, he managed to build a monumental biography of Clarice Lispector, telling this incredible story of one of the most fascinating figures in 20th century literature. And the result in the biography, Why This World, became an international and national bestseller. And in the book, he talks a lot about the phenomenon that occurred right after the publication of her first novel, Close to the Wild Heart. And she was 26 years old, and at that time, her success was so fundamental that only talked about Clarice the hurricane, and 70 years later, it would not be overstating it to say that we're experiencing a very similar phenomenon. And Clarice the hurricane is due to a great extent to Moser's efforts. Ana and Clarice never met each other, but despite that, between '59 and they lived in the same city. They were neighbors in the southern zone, Ana in Copacabana and Clarice in Leme. In the year that Ana was born in '52, Clarice was Some Stories. It had been close to the heart and the city under siege. And when she died, Ana had still not launched April Scenes. It was the first book that she produced in '79 with Heloisa. Clarice died a year after the publication of the book 26 Poets, when Ana's work was circulating in the Moreira Salles Institute in the collection of Ana Cristina Cesar, some of her books from her personal library, and the 3 books by Clarice that are commentated by her, and it's a treasure. Commentated works commentated in the margins by Ana C. Heloisa said that she first met the poetry and then the poet. You were studying Chinese and you ended up in Portuguese. I want to tell you about this story about how you ended up realizing that you were dealing with great writers. It was immediate when I discovered Clarice, because I was in a class and I'd already done a year of Portuguese, and we began to read short works in Brazilian literature, short works and several different things that I didn't think that wonderful. And I ran into The Hour of the Star. This book has been sold today thousands of copies a year. The Hour of the Star. This touched me, despite the fact that I didn't even know the language too well, but I felt something on the first page. I can still remember it, but I would not have had the idea of having that I was going to devote so many years of my life to this person, Clarice Lispector. But now it's been 12 years of active work on the work with the biography. We've already launched it in 7 different languages in the United States and England, in addition to the translations in other countries. We've just launched in the Netherlands, France, and other countries like Macedonia, which is going to be releasing it in Macedonian, and Korea, which just bought all the stories, which was launched by Rocco just recently, and which was the first time that a Brazilian book reached the front page of the New York Times. So this has had a huge impact. And I was talking to Clarice's son the other day that we are condemned to doing this or fated to doing it, because there's been increasing interest in her and increasing excitement around the world and in Brazil. So it has been a path. It's been very gratifying, this whole path. I met Ana Cristina through her poetry. I was doing an anthology which became a kind of iconic anthology. During the Brazilian dictatorship, there was a lot of censorship all over the place. There's no theater, cinema. The press was under lock and key, and poetry, which has fewer readers, slipped by the censors. And so there's a generation who witnessed that period as a marvelous period and very sharply. And I did this anthology called Marginal Poetry. It was called Marginal Why. It was outside the commercial circuit. It was marginal to the publishing system, which now there's really marginal on the periphery. But at that time, marginal poetry was marginal vis-a-vis the publishing houses, and the homemade booklets or backyard printing presses passed far from the eyes of the censors, and it grew and grew, this movement, and with rock and roll, and there were fantastic recitals and performances. What were they called? Artimanhas. I'm going to have to ask Alice to help me to remember some of the words. That was it, a mixture of music with recital, and it was very disposable and instantaneous and testimonial. So I said I had to do an anthology to mark this, and most of them were mimeographed. They were going to disappear, the backyard editions. I began to gather these editions together, and suddenly we always feel guilty. There's no women amongst them. I tried to find the women poets to be fair, and Clara said, I have a student who writes very well, and she showed me Ana's poetry. I said, my God, it's beautiful, Ana Cristina's work. And last evening I read a poem that Folha published in Severina. Severina, was that it? Okay. Cena Fina. We could switch places. Why don't you take my place over here? It's a poem written especially for this occasion called by Angélica Freitas, who is another fantastic poet. And there's a little piece that was exactly what I felt when I saw that manuscript by Ana Cesar, a piece of the poem. When she read Ana Cristina, she said, who is she? What is this? Who am I? And this is something for people who enter Anna's work and you mix in with that text and you're seduced by it and you approach it. This little verse by her makes so much sense because it's what you feel when you come close to Ana. Who is she? What is this? Who am I? That's Ana Cesar's trick, and I felt that on the spot, and I set up a meeting with her in Casa Grande, and it was great because Clara brought me. This is Ana Cristina. She dragged that scraggly girl. She was beautiful, beautiful, and performance, beautiful clothing, beautiful hair, and she could throw her hair back. She was sensational, and I saw that beautiful thing in addition to her fabulous writing, and I wanted to talk to her, and she said, "It's a pleasure," and she blushed. She was like a tomato, and it disappeared. I never spoke with her, and she panicked, and I went to meet her later, and that was once and for all. We joined together and never separated again, and I was a kind of godmother or stepmother. She's mine. She adopted me as well. So I'm a stepmother in that sense. It's my motherhood, literary motherhood, but that was how it was with Ana. What I did with Ana is the opposite of what Benjamin did with Clarice Lispector. I did homemade booklets, home binding, and we did the covers together. The covers were beautiful. It's funny because I remember the first book of hers called Scenes of April, April Scenes. I never wanted to do what I do. I always wanted to be an architect or a designer. So I made book covers. I did bookbinding at home just for the fun. And I transmitted this virus to Ana. She has this serious symptom. It's delusion. So we took this cover from April Scenes, went through the months. What was the most April, because the L was the most beautiful, because the literary critiques and the reviews are so cruel. They promote so many different readings. It's more rich. We chose April because the L was beautiful. It was going to end in L. And there are thousands of essays explaining what April means. It was fabulous. But we chose it because of the way that the L was so beautiful with a little curlicue in. Should I continue or not? Okay, just to conclude. Okay, I did the opposite. I had a private Ana with no repercussions in the middle of a group, which was not her turf exactly. What I did with Ana just have placed her in the political context and generational context of the time that she might not have. She marked a difference, but there she appeared, and she was attuned with that generation and in sync with them. What I did with Ana, I did the homemade editions with her. Some of the other things, it was extremely important at the time. April Scenes has a cover in each color we purchased in the stationery stores, and it was great. And that's why she says, I want to do the book before the text, because we got flipped out with doing the bookbinding. But she needed Moser to promote her and splash her across the world. Flip is doing this already, but we needed a little bit of a push with her, because we're playing with like dollhouses together. Of course, we talk about Angélica Freitas, the other poet, because there are a lot of readers especially who dive into Ana and Cristina's and Clarice's work, and other readers have their first contact later, and they say that it's very difficult. I remembered an interview that Clarice gave for the TV Cultura, and she said that there was a student, 17-year-old girl, who came to tell me that my Treasure Island book, or Desert Island book, and she hadn't understood anything about it, about Pedro II. Why do you think they're so hermetic and so popular at the same time? I think that it's a very easy issue. I am the person who oftentimes I take this to people who don't have the slightest idea. Here in Brazil, at least people know who Clarice is. Even if they haven't read her, they know basically who she is. And there are people here who don't like Clarice, not because they don't like for some specific reason or political reason, because they've never read and it has never struck them deeply. It's easy, you can't force people to like her. She says in the same interview, she said, touch or don't touch. My role in this, in addition to introducing the biography and her story, which is her life story, it's another thing entirely. But there are people that are highly refined people and that don't like Clarice. And so I say, fine, read something else. Read some other authors, because you can't force somebody to like her. And a man, when I present this, it's not something that you can, if you don't dive in, you've already lost the charm. You have to come with your heart and your guts, and later you can elaborate theories and so forth. But if you don't enter her with your guts, it's not worth it. You read something else. And that's a characteristic I'm writing about. Susan Sontag now was a person who's totally a head, with a huge head, brainy, and you discover the rest. You enter her, but Clarice, if you don't enter her work through your body, your heart, there's no way to force people to do that. And it's a very almost spiritual thing, I would say. Ana Cristina, I don't know anyone who doesn't like Ana Cristina. Do you know anyone, Alice, who doesn't like Ana Cristina? She has unanimity. It's rather complicated even. It's important for someone to appear that I've heard some people say that they don't understand her. They don't get her, in other words. I think that Ana, she has a characteristic which she comes close. Her thing is intimate. An intimate conversation with you, and you fall into that trap because it's not with you, and neither is it really intimate. It's totally rhetorical, that intimacy. So, but you fall into the trap. I fell into that trap, and it's a trap for the readers. She says in her essays, there's something incredible that she says. She read Mário de Andrade talking about Álvares de Azevedo, who was a poet, a bohemian, depraved poet, and he'd never done any of that. He stayed home. He was a good boy. And Mário de Andrade said, literature is pretending. And Ana says, literature is pretending. It's pretending, but it has to be based on a very personally felt foundations. Clarice is much more sincere than Ana. Clarice flows, but she's sincere. Ana does this thing of the false secrets, false intimacy with the readers, which I think is magic, because you slip. She says, okay, you fall into her trap. Clarice is the opposite of it. Clarice is very sincere, and even too sincere, because you can see when you read her writing chronologically. I think all of these stories shows ever since she was 9 years old, beginning and she goes deeper and develops in the book. You can read it to the end. That the last things that she left unfinished when she died, you can see this evolution, and you can see that it's even too much her sincerity. It hurts even. It's painful. It's the opposite. In this sense, they're the opposite. She died when she was 56 years old, and you feel that she could not stand living anymore. This effort at reaching and this intimacy that we have with Clarice is something which becomes a passion in people's lives and the readers. In my life, I don't know about yours, but I think that if we have an audience, a refined and educated audience, we're not the only ones who have felt this strength and force. And I could not imagine Clarice teaching anything. I think that she was very aware of who she was, and her stature and her beauty as well, physical beauty.
She was also very beautiful, physically beautiful, and this was obviously ever since she was a baby. She was famous in the park, and the Jewish park in Recife. She was famous for being the most beautiful child, and the playground, and in Recife. And I don't know if this was something important to her, but it's interesting to see this evolution in her biography and also in her writing. But there's something that both of them had, which I think is unique, which is a unique faith in language, which is something that you don't always see in other writers. Language with meaning. Ana Cristina is just pure language. There isn't a single moment of Ana Cristina when there's not language. And Clarice is the same thing, and this is the direction that she follows. I think when she reaches Agua Viva, Ana Cristina follows her, but she follows her. The starting point is Agua Viva. She calls something, she calls clac clac, which is onomatopoeic. There's even a struggle between them. I think Agua Viva is the book that most influenced poets at the time, and Ana Cristina certainly. Yeah, there are poets that, that say that, well, I read Agua Viva 111 times because it was something completely new at the time. And I think in my biography I show that this has even a mystical root that comes with the reverence that the mystics had in Ukraine, which is where her family came from, where they had a lot of play on words that was done with the intent of finding the God that was behind these words, behind language, behind words that were spoken. That is the poetic strength of Clarice. Even though she was never a poet, I think it's a belief in language, a belief that language works. It works and it doesn't. Because in Judaism, you have the obligation of finding out the name of God, something that you have to search for, and you know that in searching for it, you will never find it. So the mystics are condemned to find something that they already know that they are condemned never to find. And in Clarice, you see that there's this search for the mysteries of sexuality, creation, death, and birth, and how things are born from language. It's not language that describes things, but language gives birth and invents things. And there's a wealth in this for poets that is inextinguishable. And Ana has something that is not Judaism. It's not this interpretation, which I think is amazing, and Ana Cristina doesn't have that. But Ana was a Protestant, and her family was very religious. Her father was very progressive from a Protestant background, and he worked all through Latin America doing this work. So she also comes from a very religious background. She tried to distance herself from this background. There's a letter that she writes from London saying that she finally no longer believed in God. Yes, she gives an interview in 1978, and she says that in England, first time when she was an exchange student, she said that the most important thing that happened was that she no longer believed in God. But she did continue to believe in God. And in this text, you do see that that's not true, that God does have a strong presence in her life. God, as you said, this God that you don't know who this God is. And in literature or art that really moves us is a question of life and death. It's not something that you're just going to talk about at flip. It's just something that is really something that's a question of life and death, truly. And in the case of Ana Cristina, and as that of Clarice, you can say that it, in a way, it killed them, both of them. This, without this force and this excitement and this wish, they would not have reached the peaks that they did. It's something that watch out for Clarice, because it's not really literature, it's witchcraft. And that is witchcraft. You go to the root of things. And I think that if it's, Islam or Judaism or Catholicism, people are attracted by Clarice Lispector because of the importance that she gives to language and literature. Now, speaking about religion, we talked about this rupture that she had with God, and Clarice Lispector also has something like that. She married someone who was from another religion. She married a Catholic. Yeah, but then you're talking about Catholic from the ethical point of view. That's something else, more from a historical point of view. What she does is that she renounces God, the God that killed her mother. She fights with God. She thought God was God. She thought it was horrible that God killed her mother. And then she does not accept the God of her religion. the God of imposition, that you need to please God, that you go and pray 5 Hail Marys and then you're pleasing God. This is the God of history. And we can't believe in that God. If you think of the Holocaust, where 2 million children were assassinated just because they were Jews, you can't believe in this God of religion. But there are people who are born with the vocation of looking for the divine. And when religion is destroyed, as the case of the Jews or many other religions, and think that the scientific world is just means that you can't believe in these things, but you do still have a vocation of finding out what is beyond our word. And she places God in the cockroach. God is disgusting. Still, she feels the obligation of eating this and joining what she sees in rocks and within each of one of us. So Elo, you describe in the incomplete biography of Ana C., or in her correspondence, actually, that she wrote because she needed to. And in Morricone's book, which is wonderful, he says that she almost had a tic of writing all the time. And Clarice Lispector also has this thing of writing to save herself. What is this thing of writing to be free? To be free of what? She says, well, art, and this is something that she says in Agua Viva, art is not freedom. It is liberation. And I feel this more and more as a writer. I am going to turn 40, so I have a bit of a road behind me. And writing becomes more and more obsessive. And she says at a certain point, I'm not going to use the same words or beauty that she did, but she says that, well, life is fine, life is great. What bothers me is writing. And I think that any writer understands this obsessiveness, that we think that it's really cool and interesting at the beginning to have this experience, and then you become more and more, it becomes more and more dangerous. Maybe with Ana, I don't know. With Ana, I think it was a bit obsessive. She wrote without stopping, and she revised everything. And she had many doubts. But she did have this everything as she was a child. She just wrote nonstop. It was almost like a tic. She was always writing. And I have a friend who's a psychoanalyst called Numasiru. She read Lispector's, or not actually Lispector's. She read Ana C.'s letters. And she said, it's funny, she talks about her place in literature. Technically, that must be something fascinating. I'm not a psychoanalyst, so I didn't even want to understand what she was saying. I didn't ask why and what she meant, but it just stuck in my mind, this idea that I saw Ana. She couldn't not talk of another place other than literature. If we look at her letters to me, for example, all the time you can see this struggle. She says, you complain because I don't write to you and I'm only doing literature and you want to know about my life, but this is only what I can do. Literature is her place, the place where she lived. Her clothes were literary. She was always disguised. It was meaning all the time. It was her clothes was the signifier. She was like a performance artist wherever she went, and whoever she was speaking to was literature, which I think is different from Clarice Lispector. If you compare the letters of the two of them, her letters, Lispector's letters, are beautiful, are sincere. When she talks to her sisters, for example, she's speaking about her life as a woman. And Ana is always making literature. She's talking her opinions. I think it's different. I have to ask the psychoanalyst again what she meant when she said that she was in literature all the time. I'm not sure what this means, but it seems to me that it makes sense. She was always talking from the point of view of literature, from the place of literature, and to deal with Ana, to live with Ana, was anxiety. She always demanded a lot. She requested a lot. And you had to go with her. You had to follow her. It demanded a lot of you. She was strong. And Clarice Lispector also was the same. Many friends of her told me that they wanted to protect her because she was completely vulnerable and unprotected. And if you look at things, I saw some of her writing. She would just, write. And there's her lipstick on the paper. She would just write something like a little note, and you can see all this together, and you see that this was constant, that she was always writing. But it's the impulse to write and to invent a beautiful sentence. That's okay, that's one thing. But a book is something else. It's to build this together. And this demanded more and more energy from her. When she burned herself, you know that she burned herself in a fire. And she was 46 years old at the time. She was beautiful, she was famous, and she aged in one night. She couldn't walk, she couldn't write. Even physically, she was incapable of developing and elaborating the ideas that she had and put in a book. But with the help of another person, she was able to do it. But you can see that even in her hand that was burned as well, that she had a lot of difficulty. She was overcoming this difficulty because she had the need to continue writing. I think with Ana, it was more of a symptom. She did literature and she was afraid of it. She wanted to signify more than what she was doing. It was strange. Which resulted in beautiful poetry. And in the letters to you, she said, "Elo, you complain of an excess of style." Yeah, I was always asking her to stop, just tell me things. Stop with the style. And you talk about the other, who she was writing to. Yeah, that's a good question. She had a theory, and she studied a lot. She was a good student. Ever since she was a little girl, she was a girl who liked to study. And sometimes, and we read, I was her tutor, and we read a lot together. And her first question was, who was the author? And we would read Foucault, for example, who she loved, because Foucault said that the author didn't exist. There was the function of the author. And that's what she felt, because she destroyed the reader and spoke to someone who she wanted to sink. Do you remember? If you remember, you tell me, because I can't. She wrote to mobilize, and that was the verb that she used. So the letters were written to mobilize someone, right? So, but she was doing literature in her letters, so there was a certain distance in this. And one essay that she wrote about Felinto. So Marilene Felinto did not want intimacy. So she said, well, I wrote in English because this would give me a certain distance. And Ana wrote in Portuguese just like that. She was translating herself. It was interesting to see this process. And this interlocutor was a bit of a problem because this interlocutor was too close, came too close to her. There's an essay that she wrote about a poem by Whitman, where Whitman ends up very close to the reader. She liked this discovery that she made of Walt Whitman's poem, the possibility of being involved almost physically with your reader. There's this intimacy, there's this dialogue, a very intimate dialogue with the reader, that sometimes we don't even want to have because it's bothering. It bothers me. It scares me even a little bit. You do want a bit of a distance between you and the poet, but that was not the case with Anna. She did not allow you to do this. That is why she has so many women followers. She didn't call this feminine. Intimacy is a feminine thing. A bit, right? Yeah, it bothers men a little bit. A lot, I think, actually, quite. But intimacy, she defined as feminine. And she invested this very drastically. And, the readers looked at it and said, well, this is me. I can see this. I can see myself. And what Angélica Freitas wrote, it's a little piece. And she said, who is she? What is this? Who am I? So, no, the poem is too long. I'm not going to read it. So every time when I come to Rio, the first thing I do is go to her grave, and I put a stone on her grave, because that's a Jewish tradition to put a stone on a person's grave. And there, it's written. There's a sentence from the Passion According to G.H. It says, "This is always what I expected from happiness," and I love this quote. And it's a beautiful quote, but it's actually in the context of the book, which is a bit surprising because it comes from the description of G.H. So I'm talking about when you coming close to the reader. She said, "I can only tell the story if I imagine that someone's here with me. So I'm going to invent your hand, and I'm going to take it while I'm telling this story." So this wish of being close and being embraced by a person maybe doesn't exist, because many things that are written are just left in a drawer and nobody ever sees it. But the wish of the writer of being close and linked to something that maybe will be read in 100 years is a very important feature, and this is what maybe gives courage and strength to writers. Here she says it's as if reading Whitman is like becoming Whitman's lover. The fascination with the poet comes before the poet, and she establishes this intimacy and complicity with the reader. And you also talked about the question of feminine, being feminine. At the time, being a feminist was something a bit heavy, and I want you to talk about, because she was a feminist, despite not defining herself like that, and she studied a lot. So what were her ideas? She said that writing as a woman is not exactly that. What would be the definition of this feminine writing? Although that's a long answer. First of all, we have to talk about the historical moment, and that was 1970 something, under the military dictatorship. And feminism of the 60s was exploding, 60s, 70s. In the whole world, women were being liberated. They were burning bras. They were talking about their bodies. And in Brazil, there was a very progressive sector in opposition to the military government, was the Catholic Church. So feminists were not able to go together with the international feminist movement. And they did not talk about sexual freedom, the body, abortion, everything that was happening in international feminism. And Brazilian feminism did not talk about that because of the Catholic Church that was guiding the leftist movement. So you wouldn't create any controversy with one of the few institutions that was actually truly able to face the military dictatorship.
So it was kind of boring. I was a feminist myself, and I am a feminist, but at that time it was kind of anachronistic activism, because the synchronic feminism couldn't come to Brazil. There was this feminism, but it began with the working groups on women that I was part of, these working groups. So it was divided. There were the feminists who wanted the women who had been silenced to join the 19th century women, and the history had not absolved, and the silenced women. On the other side were the ones, the Lacanian women, the heiresses of Saussure, who read feminism in a different light, very psychoanalytically. So there's this radical watershed between these two groups, and all the seminars and meetings, it was a confrontation, almost knockdown, drag-out fights. So the psychoanalysts and the activists on the other side. So it was rather complicated. All of this because of Sisu, who introduced this in Brazil, this reading of Clarice, the Lacanian reading. And Ana did Lacanian psychoanalysis. She was doing Lacanian psychoanalysis, and she read, and she was a Lacanian feminist at the end, but not at the beginning. In the beginning, she was between Ana, rather. She has a text, which I can't read here. This is Ana, who is very funny because it's she was messing with me, fictional Sylvia Riveron, Sylvia Riveron. Sylvia Riveron was totally ridiculous. She participated in a rape crisis, collective, and she was a diehard activist. And when she got a job in the university, and she had to deal with texts. So when she saw text, she was desperate because her feminists wouldn't fit into the reading of a text. So she began to study Antonio Cândido. Everything that I did, she was messing with me. This is Ana Cristina writing this. This feminist, she's described in great detail. And it's in great detail with a total stereotype. And so she, this feminist, disappeared suddenly, and Ana let her disappear. Here's her definition of feminism. You want to see it? Feminism, not feminism. Let me see if I can find it here. I brought this reading. I can't read the whole thing here, but let me try and find it at least. Okay, the Brazilianist. She was a Brazilianist, Sylvia Riveron from University of Texas. Don't look at me. She's from Texas, aren't you? I'm a feminist. I'm a Brazilianist now. Okay, the person was a Brazilianist. Okay, so she saw the text, and she lost this contact with this woman. She didn't want to go try and find her because she preferred, it's written here, to remain in doubt. Where can you anchor this concept? Wouldn't it be better to leave it adrift, errant, as the winds blow of feminine in language? With this breath of feminism, she left feminism is feminine, rather, is on the order of the imaginary, and feminism is language. So she skirted that dichotomy in the fight. In other places, she says, how did she put it? How did she said, you know, the issue about being a man. I'm tired of being a man. In this little book here, I'm tired of being a man. Being a man to her was to write a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. That was her definition of males. So she wrote her narratives without a beginning, middle, and end. So this would be a definition of the stream of life, her other book, Agua Viva. I believe that it's in the booklet they're distributing here, the introduction to all stories. I talk about the feminist issue in Clarice, and you know I'm Clarice's #1 fan. I did years of work with her, and I wrote about her. And when I have to give another introduction, I'm somewhat tired. One more thing. But no, I had to make an introduction to all the stories, and I discovered something fantastic, which nobody has contradicted me. If it's not true, correct me if I'm wrong, please. But when we talk about women's literature, we talk about a reclaiming with all the prince in the past who had been silenced, the women that had been silenced for various different reasons in the past. And this is part of the 60s and 70s feminism. At the time, there's a famous essay, which I quote, famous for us Americans, the feminists, which is called Silence in Literature. Silences in Literature. And it says that 1 out of every 12, it's 12% of the texts in English language were published, classics were written by women. So what was missing was, what about these women who were the 50%? Because these people existed, but where were they left? And this is in 1961. And at that same time, Clarice had come back to Brazil from the United States, in this book, All Stories. It's the first time in history in any country. I don't know if you agree with me, but I researched this in several different countries. It's the first time that a woman writes over the course of her life. It begins the way the men begin in adolescence and to the end of her life, and she's not silenced by marriage, by children, or by indifference. Nobody cares about what you say because you're a woman. Okay, we had Raquel de Queiroz. It's an interesting example, Raquel de Queiroz, but she was silenced. There were years in which she did not write, and Clarice wrote not only throughout her life, lifelong, but she described all the phases of a woman's life, ever since childhood all the way to old age. And all of these things, there's an old woman, 81 years old. It's a somewhat gross example. There's an 81-year-old woman who masturbates. And it's even shocking, but you think to yourself that sexuality of an old woman has never been described, ever. And we know that people, elderly people, have their sexuality just like kids also have. But it's a topic that she opened up for the first time. And like that, she described the life of a girl, a talented girl who's in school. She knows that she's intelligent, that she's beautiful, and she doesn't know how she'll live, what's going to become of her. And this thing did not exist. Today, women as writers are women, women writers are so common that we forget that this is very new. I am proud to be able to announce to you all that it's in this book here. But Clarice Lispector is the first woman in the world who did that. I had never discovered another woman like that, so it's very close to us. It's work, and it's a job that sometimes people might think that we're modern. We already know that women should be equal to men, theoretically. At least there are some people who don't believe in the theory even. But at least I think that people are here agree with this. But this is something very new that we should get excited about, to learn more about it, the women's experience. Apparently, Ana Cristina is different. She doesn't ever tell. Clarice went through all these phases, and it's marvelous. But Ana Cristina, her literature, ever since the beginning, is the question, what is woman? She asks this question all the time. The feminine. She doesn't tell. It's interesting, and there's something in Clarice, which Ana talks about. She doesn't talk much about Clarice. It's very interesting what she does say. She talks a lot about Anja Melin, who is the Brazilian who's closest to her, Anja Melin. Emily Dixon, she has a feminine line, and she skipped Clarice for some reason, because they're very close, I think. The times are different, but they are very close. I forgot what I was going to say. What was I talking about? I can't remember. The issue of what is woman, okay? What is, she did this quest, this search, her literature of researching this thing, this language. It means, what woman means. It's a language issue. She doesn't talk about women, but she's very feminist. And I think it's funny that if we were to say in some places, even here, that Clarice Lispector and Ana Cristina Cesar are feminists. Oh, people say, no, they're writers. No, because feminism is like you're cursing them. giving some classes and lectures around the States with the Bank of Brazil Cultural Center is sponsoring Who's Afraid of Feminism? That's the theme. The word is like outcast. Who's not in favor of equal rights? It's that simple. It's simple, and all of a sudden people are afraid. This fear is even interesting, the fear of the word. Ana Cristina, I don't know, she didn't do anything else except think about women. And it's interesting that you talk about, in the preface to all stories, you said that when you read Machado de Assis and Guimarães Rosa, you're charmed by their work, and later you look for the author behind. With Ana, I think, and Clarice, it's somewhat more diffuse. You said that Clarice, when you read Clarice, she and the author who writes is the same person. People are already fascinated by Clarice ever since the beginning, because I interviewed a lot of people who've already died several years ago, but men 90 years old, and everyone wanted to know and meet her. Even she was a girl. She was beautiful and fascinating. People wanted to come closer. Ana was beautiful, too. And Susan Sontag, I'm doing this. The difference with Sontag, the difference is a question that I want to pose. I want to study this. Why? There's a tie between physical beauty and artistic genius. It's very common for intelligent people to be very beautiful. But isn't it a construction? It's a construct. You construct beauty. I don't know. Is it? You're beautiful. I love her. The muses here. It's a bond, because Susan Sontag, she was no one. She was a young girl from a remote town, and she came to New York, and everybody was immediately fascinated by her. Clarice, the first thing people never forget. Clarice is this beauty, this dazzling beauty. She was blonde, tall, and talkative. She had an accent even. And she had a kind of almost a lisp. And so this is an interesting condition, but it's interesting to see that men oftentimes struggle in admitting that they're feminists. I think this is crazy, because I think men don't want anything to change, but all women are also fear being feminists. This is odd. Don't you think this is changing? Yes, with the young girls. They're fabulous. They rock. The high school girls. Okay, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but we have a surprise here. I want to ask the production crew. I wanted to show the booklet.
Eu vou para cá. Isso aqui são as cartas.
These are her letters. I wanted to call your attention to the characters. When I said that she dressed literature, she dressed with literature. Look at this, a fragment of a letter, another character. Her body was literature. Here, this is a letter, the letters that she sent me that we're republishing with collages. I wanted to show you the texture. It's green paper. Another one is eggshell blue, robin egg blue, postcards. There was this detail. They're not really letters. These letters are pure literature. Characters. That's what I wanted to show you, to show her characters and her care with the letters as objects. The letter was unfinished. She crafted the letters. Papers. That's not all. Hold on. She's talking about the letters. We're sorry we can't hear the recording in the translation booth.
Pelo prazer do texto, não é um poema que você está produzindo, não é uma questão que você está levantando dentro de literatura, não é uma produção estética necessariamente. Fundamentalmente, carta você escreve para mobilizar alguém, especialmente se a gente entra no terreno da paixão, tá? Onde o responder fica mais quente. Você quer mobilizar alguém, você quer que através do teu texto, um determinado interlocutor fique mobilizado. Tá? É muito dirigido, muito sensorial, função tática, né? Muito centrado naquilo que é a segunda pessoa. Então, carta é cheio de vocativo, é cheio de exortações a alguém. Né? É alguém que toca uma carta, nem que você esteja falando de coisas suas.
Ah.
Amongst these numerous coincidences between Ana Cristina and Clarice, there's a book by Ana with some childish poems. Poems, only read them if you have a pure and sweet heart. And in the introduction to The Passion According to G.H., Clarice writes, a preface, I would be happy if this book were read by people with fully formed soul. It's funny that I met Clarice's granddaughter, who's a designer in Rio, Mariana Valente, who did something in Portugal, beautiful, which is ceramic, which is a tribute to the passion, according to G.H. She went to Vista Alegre to do a studio experiment in designing this thing. And she had never read The Passion According to G.H. because she said that when she picked it up for the first time, she was 14, 15 years old, she read this warning to possible readers, and she read it and she began, and she said she was kind of wary. She said, perhaps it might be good for me to listen to this and hear that and not read it now. So we went to Portugal to do this thing there with the ceramics 15 years later, and she was frightened because of the book. She said Clarice was right to have warned people that you have to have your identity ready to be able to deal with this book. Otherwise, she said that she was happy with the adolescent who had understood that it was not the right time yet to read it, because it's not for everybody to read The Passion According to the G.H., this issue of literature as life or death. It's not a laughing matter, and people think that art is on one level and separate from daily life, but it's not. It can interfere in daily life, and it's good to walk carefully. I've received a million different questions here. I can't ask all of them. I apologize. Several of the questions that I myself would have liked to ask. Flavia Lenz, Ana Cesar's brother, Ana Cristina brother, she said Heloisa did not tell the short verse that captured her to learn about Ana Cristina's work. And if you remember Heloisa, the poem, do you remember the short verse? You said that the first poem by her, it was her intimate diary. It was the beginning of April Scenes. I received April Scenes, but the short verse is Angelica Freitas. I think you got those two mixed up. And she asked if Benjamin could recite the phrase, or his favorite line from Clarice. That, I don't know. Everyone asks me that, and I've never have a good answer. I should have one.
Clarice is something that, to me, I know her work very well, of course, but every time I read it, I find things that I hadn't seen before. So to me, it's always something that is so rich that maybe I'll read something there tomorrow that will impress on me something that I hadn't read before. I don't know. And there's a last question here. There are many questions here. So Moser, about the translation of Clarice's works. So I'm sorry, there's not much time. So what's it like to translate this? Her language that is so strange, her syntax that is so strange. What is the process of translating Clarice? Well, it's very interesting because even here in Brazil, people who revise her text try to write in her language, straighten her language, and that's not possible because she writes strangely. And when you translate this into another language, you need to be very careful to let her have the same accent, the same strangeness that she has in Portuguese. And all other translators, I'm always struggling with other translators to allow Clarice to be strange in other languages. And by now I have a lot of practice in this because I've been translating her for a while, but it's always a struggle, and it's not easy. It's not something that can be answered just right or wrong. But I think that if you respect her poetics, then you can come closer but not too close. I think that Guimarães Rosa, for example, I think it's untranslatable. You can do, 1.5 million footnotes, but what in the end you have like a dead text. What you have is an academic treatise and not a real live translation. So Clarice, we can get as close as possible, as strange as possible. And Elo, you wanted to say something about translation. I wanted to talk about Ana as a translator because we don't have a lot of time. So she did 2 MA dissertations. One is called Literature is Not a Document, and this is a dissertation about the impossibility of translating images in literature. It was half about writers who were being funded by Ember Films. And so there was funding, and a lot of people wrote about that. So she wrote about this. She wrote about some films and talked about how it's impossible to translate image. And the second one was really about translation. She was fascinated with translation, and this has a lot to do with her profile about the other, how to reach the other, how to understand the other, and listen. And that's what translation is in the end. And her dissertation is very moving. She went to study the sociology of translation. Then she thought it was very boring, very academic, and ended up working in straight translation, which is what she wanted. And she translated a short story called Bliss, which is a very beautiful short story by Catherine Mansfield, and which Clarice Lispector also read by Clarice Lispector. And it is a very intense book. So she translated this short story. It's a very short story. It's a short story, but she had 80 footnotes. She probably wrote as much as Catherine Mansfield. And the footnotes are just fascinating because it is just footnotes about untranslatability, the delicacy of reaching or coming closer to the writer and how you can't do that. And she translated the word bliss. We don't really have the word bliss in Portuguese. She translated it by ecstasy. And she has a very, very long text all about the translation and the impossibility of translating the word bliss. And ecstasy became a leitmotif for the whole thing. And ecstasy actually became language. Ecstasy is not happiness. Ecstasy is a feeling that you don't normally have. It's she says that it's of the mother of the child and the child of homosexual fantasy. She gives a series of examples of situations that would lead to ecstasy. And Clarice was reading Agua Viva, and she was also writing Agua Viva, and she was defining ecstasy. She said, I'm sad to say, because ecstasy is something that you can't have in your daily life. And it's amazing, this ending. I think this is incredible, such a coincidence. But I think that the most profound work is the translation of Bliss, I think, even more than her poems. This is a great union between Clarice and Ana. And Ana C. also says that writing depends on technique, and that she was fascinated by Catherine Mansfield, by her letters, her biography. And she also died almost at the same age. I think that Catherine Mansfield died when she was 32 or 34 as well. Yeah, both of them died very young. Well, I have many, many questions, and I think we're going to have to go outside and talk. So this was wonderful. Thank you both very much. Thank you all.